It's a real pleasure to introduce Ken Reed because of what happened to his mid-career choices. He was a student in sports management. He got his PhD. He was a varsity athlete. He was a coach, and then he went into marketing. And after a number of years marketing corporate boxes at stadiums, he said, "This is not what I want to do in life. I want to do something that's more important and more significant." Now, not many people do that. They get stuck in their career choices. And so 2011, he became our policy director for leagueoffans.org, if you want to look up the website, leagueoffans.org. In amateur and professional sports, the fans don't have much voice. And the fans are reduced to spectators. And what Ken is interested in is not just cleaning up professional sports and NCAA rackets and universities, but he wants people to be in participatory sports. He wants them to exercise more and to enjoy neighborhood sports and to indulge in unorganized sports, as some of us remember from our childhood. To top it off, he's become the leading commentator on the dark side of sports in America, and there's a lot of dark sides. His phrase, "profit at any cost, win at any cost," is a very accurate description of what's going on today, right down to the middle school, to the high school, to the university, to professional sports. He compares what's going on in Europe, where they have sports clubs that don't distort university education priorities for the athletes. They're separate. They have national sports councils to deal with policy. In the US, we have antitrust exemptions for monopolistic sports leagues instead. He also has written several books. Some of them are in the bookstore. And one of them is How We Can Save Sports, a Game Plan. Another is interviews of sports reformers you may never have heard of, but they have a real passion. They spend a lot of their time, sometimes on their own time, local and national, trying to make sports safer, cleaner, better, more participatory. And he has a book called Ego versus Soul in Sports, essays on sports at its best and at its worst. He's also written a novel for girls aged 10 to 14. He had daughters at that age. And that was called Sarah's Big Challenge, a sports novel. And the overarching theme of the book is the importance of being true to yourself. And so I give you Ken Reed.
Already accomplished one of my goals. I didn't hit my head on the screen coming up. I appreciate the nice introduction. One of the things he didn't mention was that I am not a lawyer. I've never played a lawyer anywhere except maybe today. So I want to apologize up front if I butcher some legal terms or some legal concepts. I'll do my best here. I've written about these issues, just not a lot of legal ramifications. But my talk today is sports and torts, or sports and the law of wrongful injuries. And up until recent years, one of the classic examples of a tort case in sports involved a couple baseball players. One, John Roseboro, who was a catcher for the Los Angeles Dodgers. The other was Juan Marichal, pitcher for the Giants. So we are going back to 1965 here, so maybe some of the old-timers might remember those names, but Marichal ended up in the Hall of Fame, which I'll touch on in a second. But this was a battery case. It was August 1965. Dodgers and Giants were in a struggle pennant race. Besides being arch rivals, they were actually in a pennant race. This was game 3 of a 3-game series. The first couple games saw some beanballs, some shouting matches between dugouts, So the tensions were already pretty high when this occurred. Marichal was pitching for the Giants, and in the National League, and then and now, the pitchers hit. So Marichal comes to the plate. Roseboro is the catcher. He pops off, says something to Marichal. Marichal says something back. And before there's a pitch even thrown, Marichal lifts his bat up and swings as hard as he can and hits Roseboro in the face, right above the left eye. Blood squirts everywhere. 15-minute brawl. Roseboro ends up with 14 stitches and chronic headaches for the rest of the season. So he files an intentional tort lawsuit. Takes a while, but they reach a settlement, and they remain bitter enemies for 10 or 15 years. Marichal calls him up and says, John, do you still hate me? And he goes, no. And he says, I could really use some help with an endorsement letter to get into the Hall of Fame. Because Marichal knew that this incident, which was all over the newspapers, cover of Sports Illustrated, was going to be held against them by the Hall of Fame voters. So if Roseboro came out and wrote a nice letter, he might have a chance. Roseboro does it, and they end up being like best of friends through the rest of their careers till Roseboro passed away. But that was cited for a long time in legal cases as a classic example of a tort in the world of sport. So moving up a couple decades here, as I'm sure most all of you are aware by now, football has a problem. Senator said, Houston, we have a problem. Well, football has a problem, and it's concussions, subconcussive hits, brain trauma, leading to something that's called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. There's hundreds of former NFL players filed lawsuits against the NFL because they started to have symptoms of CTE, which is memory loss, anger issues, other neurological problems that just become more chronic and more chronic as they age. They suspected that the NFL knew about this problem long before it became public. So they sued, wanting to find out what the NFL knew about head trauma and when they knew it. Well, of course, the NFL adopts the big tobacco's playbook and denies everything. They even come up with some questionable research they called scientific papers. In the years 2003 to 2009, the NFL published a few papers in a journal called Neurosurgery. Just happened to be that the editor-in-chief was a consultant for the New York Giants, member of the National Football League. So these studies, if you can believe some of these conclusions, here's a couple conclusions from these studies. Pro players don't suffer repetitive blows to the brain on a regular basis. They don't suffer a blow to the brain in an NFL game. Okay. Second one, no NFL player has ever suffered chronic brain damage as a result of repeat concussions. Well, we know those are completely false now. There was a couple key doctors that discovered CTE, started studying this and talking about it. One was Dr. Bennett Amalu, another was Dr. Ann McKee. The NFL invited them to a medical conference. At this point, Amalu and McKee thought the NFL was actually interested in finding out about what this disease was, how they might be able to start preventing it. Instead, they got them in this conference and just started bullying and mocking these scientists, calling their work not appropriate science, pure speculation, not real. Move up a few more years, New York Times did a comprehensive analysis and found that the research that was published by the NFL was significantly flawed and probably knowingly flawed. A couple years ago, PBS had a great documentary on this subject called League of Denial, where they looked at what the NFL had been doing to hide this research for years. They found that the NFL's approach was to look at this issue not as a health issue, but as one, a legal problem, two, a PR problem. There's an interesting quote by the Union of Concerned Scientists on this very topic. By undermining concussion science for so many years and by harassing and marginalizing the scientists whose research added to our understanding of the dangers of concussions, The NFL clearly showed how powerful business entities can threaten independent science. NFL efforts to suppress scientific evidence of the links between football and concussions not only put its own players at risk for memory loss, impulse control problems, and progressive dementia, but also put at risk thousands of college athletes and 1.2 million youth athletes ages 6 to 12 that play tackle football. That's just up to age 12, and there's a couple million more that play up to high school age tackle football. Many of them, probably most of them, who are completely unaware of the risk of playing football. So a couple of years ago, NFL and the former players settled. It was a $1 billion settlement, which sounds pretty good until you consider the number of players, the symptoms they had, the medical bills they had, and the fact that in 1 year, the NFL makes $1 billion from sponsorships alone. 200 players and their families opted out of the suit because of the restrictions and the parameters of how they were going to get the settlement. They've decided to go on filing their own lawsuits against the NFL. But the NFL won big on this. Take away the $1 billion, which wasn't huge for them. They didn't have to open any of their records. They didn't have to show any of their research. They didn't admit any guilt. And as a result, we still don't know what they knew and when they knew it. But the NFL, I don't know how many players there are, a couple thousand in the league. It's just the tip of the iceberg. We got about 300 football brain trauma-related lawsuits at the NCAA level now. Similar, less than that, but several at the high school level as well. It's even gone down to the Pop Warner League, which is the primary youth football league in this country. A couple lawsuits out there in Pop Warner. There's parents filed these lawsuits. Their sons died in their early 20s. It was discovered that they had CTE in their 20s. So this isn't, people think it's, oh, when they're 65 this stuff pops up. It can happen much earlier than that. Unfortunately, at this point, we can only determine if they have CTE after they're deceased, and it's a study of their brain. There's no other way. They're looking for a marker of some type in the blood to catch it sooner, but right now, the only way we find out is after they've passed away. So these Pop Warner parents' lawsuits claims that Pop Warner refused to publicly acknowledge and or disclose what it had known for years, that repeated blows to the head with inadequate equipment. Pop Warner used terrible quality helmets, put its participants at a significantly higher risk of suffering traumatic brain injuries with lasting chronic effects to the brain. We'll see how that turns out, but it's the tip of the iceberg. We're going to get more and more of these lawsuits at the high school level and the youth level. In July of 2017, there was a huge Journal of the American Medical Association, JAMA article that came out that looked at all the former football players who had had their brains examined to see if they had CTE after they passed away. So of the 202 former players, 177 were found to have CTE. That's 87%. 14 high school players. Now these are, when I say high school players, they played football up to high school, didn't play anymore after that. So all they did was play up to high school. 3 of the 14, or 21%, had CTE. If you go ahead and play 4 years of college, there was 53 college players that didn't play beyond college. 48 of 53 of those college players, 91% CTE. 9 of 14 semi-pro players. 7 of 8 Canadian Football League players. And out of the 111 former NFL players whose brains were examined, 110 had CTE, 99%. Now, admittedly, there's quite a bit of selection bias in this because the brains they looked at were often donated by family members, wives, children, because they had exhibited some of these symptoms I talked about earlier. So they thought there was a chance they had CTE. So it's a little biased study, but instead of 110 of 111, say it's 50 out of 111. That's still a very serious problem. One of the fallouts from this is that at the $1 billion lawsuit I talked about earlier, of course the NFL had insurance, so the insurance companies weren't too excited to see that they had settled for $1 billion because they were going to be on the hook for paying a lot of those settlement costs. So in 2017, 25 insurance companies sued the NFL because they had read some of these studies and analyses showing that the NFL had hidden some research, hidden knowledge, memos, emails internally at the NFL offices showing that they knew what was going on. They wanted to see those records because they were on the hook for paying these costs. So they started to send out subpoenas to these teams. So far, the league and the franchises have stonewalled them, and they haven't got what they've been looking for, but that's an ongoing lawsuit as well. So let's jump from football to baseball for a second. The last couple years, there's been a lot more in the media about foul balls at baseball games, going into the stands, striking fans, injuring them, especially little kids and senior citizens. A couple skull fractures with kids, severe eye injuries. So where is historically baseball, or the courts, where have the courts stood on this? Through the years, the courts have rested on what they call the baseball rule. It's basically an assumption of risk on the part of fans, that the courts have ruled that as a fan, you're going into a baseball stadium, you have to assume the risk that there's a chance you could get hit by a foul ball. So that pretty much held for decades. For years, on the back of your ticket, when there used to be actual tickets instead of tickets on phones, but on the back, there was a waiver in very, very small print saying, as a fan, you assume these risks. Of course, they never made you read that, and you didn't have to sign anything, but it was there. So where we're at with baseball is we have a business in which the business puts its customers in seats, unprotected, where hard objects over 100 miles an hour, if you're down the lines around first and third base, are hit into the stands. There was a study in 2014 that showed there was 1,750 fans hurt by batted balls each year. Now compare that to hitters who get hit by pitches when they're up to bat. There was 300 more spectators injured by fans, 300 more, spectators hit by foul balls than there were hitters hit by pitches in all those games. Every team plays 162 games, 30 teams. There was more spectators hurt than batters hit. So things are changing, though. The old baseball rule is losing clout, and there's a couple reasons why. Fans are sitting 20% closer to the fields than they were 50 years ago. These modern stadiums have kind of been throwbacks, old style, and they wanted the fans to get closer, get a better experience, so the seats are closer to the field now. The players are much stronger than they were 50 years ago. The foul balls coming into the stands are coming at much greater speeds. And so while fans may assume that a foul ball could hit them, there's no way that they can assume how hard or realize how hard these foul balls might be coming at them. There's one study showed that the average was 1.1 of a second. If you're sitting on first and third, by the time one of these line drive foul balls is hit, and the time you have to react and try to protect yourself. So then, now you also throw in our smartphones, and the distractions multiply. People are looking at their text messages, checking social media. And this is interesting, a Wall Street Journal article, in the average 3-hour baseball game, there's only 18 minutes of action. Don't laugh, football fans. There's not much more in football. But obviously, people are talking and conversing a lot. So if the foul ball's hit and someone yells, "Look out," it's too late. Another interesting study was that between 1998 and 2018, there was 14,000 more foul balls entering the stands than there was in 1998. So there's a lot more opportunities for fan injuries during the season. There was an excellent William and Mary Law Review article, I read most of it, that said the baseball rule is totally outdated. It fails the law and economic standards of optimally allocated tort liability. The courts and legal scholars are now increasingly realizing that legal liability should be imposed on the party in the best position to prevent injury on the most cost-effective basis. Well, that's obviously the teams are in the best position to do that. It costs between $8,000 and $12,000 per 60 feet of safety netting to put up, extend the netting down the lines. Per 60 feet, $8,000 to $12,000. We're talking about a league, Major League Baseball, with annual revenues of $10 billion last year. So given this risk to fans, why has baseball resisted adding more safety netting? They've had this strong fear of pushback from fans in the most expensive seats that if we put safety netting up, they won't pay $100+ for that seat anymore, which I always found as an interesting argument because for more than 100 years we've had backstops, safety netting or metal backstops behind home plate to protect those people from foul balls that go directly back. Those are the highest priced tickets in the stadium. So people are sitting there with safety nets, not those metal backstops you had growing up, but really thin safety nets. They're paying top dollar to sit there and no one gripes about that. So I think it's an empty threat or fear that down the lines that people would revolt and stop coming to the games. The courts are starting to look at this baseball rule or assumption of risk defense and knocking some holes in it. That Georgia courts have held that children hit by balls can't be said to have assumed risk due to their age. So how can a 2-year-old, 5-year-old, 6-year-old assume risk? Parents of a 6-year-old who was hit by a baseball and had his skull broken by a foul ball at an Atlanta Braves game reached an undisclosed settlement with the team, which reportedly was quite large, wasn't disclosed. 2 years ago in LA at a Dodgers game, a 79-year-old fan was killed by a foul ball. She was struck and died 5 days later. The family sued, won a huge settlement. In another case, the court has now ruled that if a team deviates from established custom in this foul ball category, plaintiffs' cases can go on to jury. So what is established custom? You know, for years it was just a backstop behind home plate. Established custom is changing, though, when it comes to safety netting. A few years ago, the commissioner actually asked teams to extend the netting down to the dugouts instead of just behind home plate. Not every team, but most teams have done that now. 5 teams, based on some of these recent cases and settlements and the negative publicity they got, 5 teams in Major League Baseball say they are now going to extend the netting well past the first and third base dugouts, either halfway down the outfield or all the way to the foul pools. In Japan's highest professional baseball league, it's been standard of care to run safety netting down all the way to the foul pools. The Players Union in the last 5 years has come out very strongly for adding safety netting. There was an incident where a Chicago Cubs player named Albert Almora hit a baseball screamer, hit a little girl, blood everywhere. He just started breaking down at home plate crying, stepped out of the box, was crying because of what he had done. That led him and his teammates on the Cubs to make a strong statement for we need more safety netting. Chris Bryant, their star third baseman, said any safety measure we can take to make sure fans are safe, we should do it immediately. So, the established custom on what's the norm in these cases has changed, making these teams that don't follow suit and extend their netting, they're going to be a lot more liable for some of these lawsuits. Finally, the last thing on the baseball example, I came across this case that's now known as the flying hot dog case. It's from the hard to believe file, but at a 2009 Royals game, a fan was hit in the eye by a flying hot dog shot from an air cannon that the Royals mascot had. I don't know if you've seen those at games where they shoot T-shirts and stuff. So he's running around firing. This time, he put it behind his back and fired. Hit a fan. This is where the funny part ends. Fans suffered a detached retina and multiple other injuries. He sues the team, goes to trial in 2011. The jury ruled that getting hit by a flying hot dog is an inherent risk of attending a game. Have any of you thought, hey, if I go into a game, it's possible I could get hit by a flying hot dog? I don't know what that jury was thinking, but the fan appealed to the Missouri Court of Appeals, which didn't agree. The Missouri Court of Appeals said the risk of being hit in the face by a hot dog is not a well-known incidental risk of attending a baseball game. So the fan goes to a new trial. 2 years later, the jury found neither the fan or the Royals at fault. So, interesting case, weird ending. Last one I want to touch on is fights in hockey, intentional tort of battery. For years, hockey players have assumed the risk of injury. It's a very physical game, a lot of pushing, shoving, checks into the boards, etc. So the courts have ruled there's an implied consent on the part of the players that when you take the ice, you're at risk for could be serious injuries. However, there was a case, Agar v. Canning, that found the defendant liable for battery due to definite resolve to cause serious harm. Thus, they ruled that this doesn't fall under implied consent because the implied consent covers players who can expect to get hit. Maybe they get a shoulder separation, whatever, get knocked into the boards, but they don't have an implied consent when it comes to getting punched in the face. So, in terms of hockey fights, there's now a distinction being made between injuries suffered through collisions that are part of the game versus the deliberate and unnecessary harmful acts. And then, of course, there's the classic cases where in hockey there's grudges that can hold over from one game to the next, and one team's thug says, I'm going to get that guy next time we play. But you see them drop the puck, and within 3 seconds, they're brawling. So that's clearly not part of the game and does no longer fall under the implied consent concept. So that's all I had, and if there's any questions, I'd be glad to take some. Yes?
I'm curious if you know who represented the NFL in the litigation against the original CBD litigation.
I don't offhand. I've written about it, so it's probably somewhere in my writings, but I can't remember right now.
I listened to an ESPN show called Hardly Interruption.
Yeah. Yeah.
And periodically, they actually express the idea that football can't be made safe.
Well,
And maybe something broader should be done about that. And that's pretty impressive to hear that on a national TV show.
yeah, especially
In terms of football, what's going to happen to football?
especially since that show's on ESPN, and ESPN is basically partners with the NFL in terms of paying for the broadcast rights. So that person might have got a little whipping in the back room after that show. No, I truly think football's in deep trouble. Concussions aren't just football injuries. There's hockey, we talked about. There's soccer. Soccer is not getting nearly the attention for causing problems that could lead to CTE and other problems. The nation as a whole is focusing on concussions, thinking it's only concussions that lead to CTE, but the research is now showing that it's repetitive subconcussive impacts, the banging of heads constantly, that leads to the long-term damage and brain disease. So think about soccer, how many times they're doing headers with balls coming 50, 60 miles an hour at them. And I found this study of former Italian professional players, and you know, they're in very similar shape to old-time football players in terms of memory loss and CTE and anger issues and some of these same symptoms, neurological symptoms. So soccer's can be saved, though, because you can, I mean, the purists are going to cringe, but if you actually took away the headers and you took balls off your shoulders or even with your arms, as long as you didn't touch it with your hands, the game would resemble a lot like the game we see today, but you can't take the collisions out of football unless you go to flag football, and I'm guessing the ratings might drop a little if it's just flag football. So that one thing that I think football can do, and the Ivy League has kind of led the way on this, is to eliminate, in the Ivy League, they eliminated tackling completely during the week once the season starts. So instead of 5 days of tackling during the week in practice and then once on Saturday, they're down to once a week of tackling. And so that's obviously going to lessen the chances of concussions or takes away the number of impacts. So at the very least, they should do that. NFL, in their latest CBA agreement with the players, has severely limited contact, full contact during practices. It's sad to say right now that high schools and youth football have more full contact practices during the week than the NFL does, or the Ivy League. So I think definitely there should be no contact during the week. You can still run your plays, do all your drills, etc. But that's one step. Football, especially at the high school level, is in trouble because there's a lot more parents getting together, participation's down, and the insurance companies are not interested in continuing to insure these school districts, seeing that some of the lawsuits that have come already and projecting the amount of lawsuits that are coming in the future. I think football is going to live on. It's so popular here, but I think it's going to move from high schools, publicly funded high schools with tax dollars, to private clubs. So parents who want to put their kids in football can still do it outside high schools. But it's going to take a while because football is a religion in this country. So, okay. Thank you.